Part number P59, undercarriage and wheel shield from the 1930s aeroplane constructor set. Hi folks and welcome back. When I started to write this script, I found myself in a bit of a pickle, as one might put it. And that's what to talk about. Because there are a number of stories to follow here, from oil transportation and how it's defined our lives, to the effects on our world. But I think we've probably heard enough of that for the time being in the news. Even how we use our products. But at times, you just have to sit down and start. So, this week, it's the articulated petrol tanker from the 1969 Set 3 my brother got for Christmas of that year. It's also the last of the highway set from that period. And first and foremost, it's not a petrol tanker. That's the name I would give it. It's still the name I would give it. Officially, it's a tank truck for petroleum-based flammable cargo. It's a bit like a hoover is not a hoover. Well, it might be, but it might also be a Dyson. It's a name that we, the unknowing masses, call it incorrectly. So there you go. From now on, we can all use the correct name. Or not, it's your choice. And by the way, neither is this a fuel bowser. That is something else, and I'll come to that later. The tanker is a common sight on our roads. At times a welcome one, thinking back to the fuel crisis during the pandemic, to a not so welcome one, when you're stuck behind it on narrow country roads. But these tankers move around 55 million tonnes of refined petroleum products on the UK road network yearly. Our reliance on petroleum-based fuel, either petrol or diesel, is huge. It is quite literally one of the keystones of our society. Remove it and we would be in serious trouble very quickly. I talked last month about the lorry and how our goods are moved. But this lorry is the means for our next day delivery to be able to be next day. After all, without this, the engine won't turn. Tanker, though, is something that I've seen all my life, but its existence is only around 100 years old. I can remember as a child looking at a Lego kit of a Shell tanker. The kit number is 671. And at the time I loved the shape and form of it. I never did buy it as a child. It was right at the end of my Lego days, and to be honest, I was spending my money on Airfix kits by then. We talk now about petroleum products and how they're affecting our world. And I'm not going to argue global warming here. I'm here to talk about history. But we've been using these products for over 4,000 years. Natural asphalt was used in construction in the city of Babylon. The first streets of Baghdad were paved with tar. And no doubt, not long afterwards, sand, giving us the earliest forms of tarmac. The first nation to use petroleum as a fuel to burn were the Chinese over 2,000 years ago. And their history of drilling for gas is amazing. And at this point I want to go off topic and talk about that, but I won't. I am sure I will have a drill head to talk about at some point. But from the get-go, the problem was how to transport this new fuel. In the Far East, as petroleum was used as a fuel for burning, the volumes weren't too great. Therefore, bamboo would do the job. In the Middle East, amphoras would suffice for the transportation of oil-based products. These clay jars could carry a reasonable volume and were easy to stack and ship. In Europe, with our large reserves of forests, wooden barrels were used to transport oil-based products. For a long time, these light crude oil products such as paraffin and kerosene were used to light our lamps and power our stoves. For those of you who have never heard a paraffin stove burning, it's a wonderful sound and smell. Towards the end of the 19th century, a need to transport petroleum in larger amounts was needed. No longer would the small store held in your local coaching inn be good enough. And as motor garages appeared, along with a sign proclaiming the sale of motor spirit in Britain, it quickly became apparent that a better method of transportation and storage of petrol was needed than the humble square metal can that was in use at the time. At first, petrol was transported on horse and cart in the square tin. Sometime in the 1880s, the first all-metal tank was fitted to a horse-drawn cart. This made for a much safer method of transport for the fuel. In 1910, Anglo-America, which is a subsidiary of the Standard Oil Company, merged the idea of an early internal combustion engine with that of metal tanks that had been pulled by horses. And the fuel tanker was born. Anglo-America introduced the idea of fuel being stored in underground tanks in the 1920s in the UK. This was a much better idea than having metal tins of highly flammable liquid stacked in the corner of the workshop, when at the time everybody, well, nearly everybody, smoked. A source of fire and the idea of fumes being given off by flammable liquids, what could possibly go wrong with that, I ask you? The first Anglo-American fuel trucks in Britain would carry around 1,000 imperial gallons, or around 4,500 litres. By the 1930s, this was increased over threefold as more vehicles started travelling on the UK road network. And post-World War II, the volume of traffic would see the start of an exponential growth in the volume of fuel transported daily. And with it came a new science. Well, a new science to the automotive trade, that is. Anyone who knows anything about the transportation of goods at sea knew about this for years. But what would us landlubbers know? And that's the science behind the free surface effect. Or simply this: if you have a vehicle moving at a set speed, then everything inside it is also moving at that speed. If you come to a sudden stop, whatever you are carrying is still moving at whatever speed you are travelling at. And Newton's third law takes over. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Or more simply put, fuel trucks started to crash and we didn't know why. In the end, the idea of baffles was mentioned, and by fitting baffles to the tanks of a liquid carrier, the wave action was broken up and the crashes stopped happening. Because the idea of exploding fuel trucks looks great in a movie, but in real life it's not so much fun. Today's tankers have separate compartments in the truck, each one carrying a smaller amount of fuel. As the fuels are separated, it allows the tanker to drop different grades of fuel to different garages. And as each compartment is smaller, then the free surface effect mentioned earlier cannot build up the momentum needed to cause the crash. And the figures are huge for the amount of fuel needing to be moved each year for the UK. A whopping 45,300 million litres of petrol and diesel on our roads being transported and consumed yearly. The number is so vast, it made no sense to me, and I ended up phoning my brother to ask if I had this correct. And breaking it down to individual amounts makes it a lot simpler. We all use around 1,000 litres of fuel yearly, or about 20 tanks of fuel across the year. And it's not till you start looking at the data across a longer period of time that you start to see the bigger picture. In 1990, the furthest back I can go, we consumed 39 million tonnes of fuel a year. In 2021, it was 33 million tonnes. And that surprised me, because even the pre-pandemic figures of 2019 show around 39 million tonnes being consumed yearly, with roughly twice the amount of diesel being consumed compared to petrol, which is understandable given that diesel is needed in our transportation sector. But in the last 30 years, there has been no shift in the volume of fuel either transported or consumed. But yet we're told constantly that we're using more fuel than ever before. Call me a cynic, but somebody's not telling the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, as the facts don't support the narrative. Of the only sector to see an increase is aviation, as we have seen a 100% increase in the amount of aviation fuel we use yearly across the same period of time. These 6 builds that have made up the 1960s highway set have been great fun to build, and could so easily be powered by the addition of either a magic motor or an electric motor. By the time that it was realised, as is so often the case with Meccano, technology had moved on. This was the period of the Austin Mini and the Ford Escort and Capri. And while the motor lorry is fine, the cab on the petrol tanker is a much older design. But nevertheless, there was a lot to be enjoyed. And I will say, I'm glad to see the back of this script. At the time of writing it, I'm beginning to get surrounded by moving boxes, and my stress levels are going through the roof. And all of that stress will be over by the time this airs in February of 2024.